Hello, everyone. Welcome to Commie Reading Group Stream 4. Today we'll be reading Capital's Grave by Jodi Dean. And hi, Maggie. How you doing? I'm sorry, I don't have a webcam on today, but because I'm not looking my best, but I'm here. Um, Thank you for being patient during the hiatus. I was having some connection issues. So, let's begin. We left off at transition or communism. The complex temporalities disrupting stagist accounts of the transition from feudalism to capitalism reappear in theorizations of the transition from capitalism to communism. A paradox persists at the core of Marxist thought. Communism builds from capitalism, is made possible by capitalism, and is its negation a radical break from all that exists. Hi, Seth. How you doing, comrade? I thought I thought you were supposed to be mod. I thought you were a mod. Hold on 1 second. There you go. I don't know what happened there. Just trying to stay cool. Awesome. Anyway, where was I? Lenin finds the resolution of the paradox in the state, more specifically in the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the transitional state form. The emancipation of the proletariat involves more than winning political power. It requires the proletariat's active exercise of power, with the goal of building communism. Bourgeoisie resistance has to be suppressed. Classes have to dissolve. The people have to develop new habits and capacities. The moment from capitalism to communism is a transition. Dictatorship of the proletariat names the political form of that transition, a state that aims at its own dissolution. Antony Balibar takes up Lenin's discussion of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the context of debates in the French Communist Party, the PCF, in the 1970s. Like other communist parties in Western Europe, the PCF abandoned the dictatorship of the proletariat in favor of the so-called democratic road to socialism. Against the Eurocommunist position, Bolivar argues that there isn't a transition to socialism. Socialism is not a transitional mode of production between capitalism and communism. Socialism is a transitional period within capitalism. It denotes a time where there are classes and class conflict, multiple contradictory interests, and the presence of the bourgeoisie legal form. The dictatorship of the proletariat isn't an alternative to socialism. It is socialism. Both name the period of transition from capitalism to communism. Reformist Eurocommunists failed to understand this. Boulevard emphasizes that the dictatorship of the proletariat isn't necessarily more than the form of a state that aims at its own dissolution. It is also the reality of a historical tendency. Communism develops out of the contradictions of capitalism, the socialization of production, and the class struggle through which the proletariat learns to organize itself and replace competition with solidarity. These two forms in which communism tendency appears under capitalism opposes each other, only coming together with the proletariat's revolutionary seizure of power. Bolivar writes, history hasn't shown that the conditions for such a revolution are only produced by capitalism when it has arrived at the stage of imperialism, and unevenly from country to country, though the movement is globally irreversible, which does not mean that it is irreversible in any particular case. Imperialism is the stage when the revolution against capitalism becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Bellabard's assumption of unidirectional movement has not been borne out. From the fragmentation of production associated with neoliberal globalization to defeat suffered by the working class in the communist movement, the fragility of socialist victories is impossible to deny. Nevertheless, his insight into the simultaneous and contradictory development of imperialism and the dictatorship of the proletariat is indispensable. Belabar reminds us not only of the unevenness, inextricable, interextricable from imperialism, but also on the fact that imperialism is the stage of capitalism. No, hold on, I'll type the word in the chat for you. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the political form through which the proletariat wage classes struggle within the stage. At the time Belabar was writing, much of the communist movement emphasizes the opposition between socialism and imperialism. The assumption was that they were two utterly separate and complete opposite camps. Bellabard rejects this thesis, arguing for their mutual imper canton. I don't know. Imperadication. Neither form is pure. They interact with and influence each other. He explains, the notion of the two roads places communism in an impossible position. The socialist road represents the future. The imperialist road represents the past. Between this past and this future, there can be, by definition, be no interdependence, no interaction, simply the tenuous thread of a movement of transition, although more difficult to grasp because it is still to come, and yet has already taken place. Oh no, you're fine, Maggie. Greg! Welcome in, Greg. How you doing? The presumption of two separate roads makes it theoretically impossible for socialism to imagine revolutions occurring within imperialism. It prevents analysis of conflicts within the socialist bloc and of the influence of capital on socialist countries. In contrast, imperialism understood temporarily as an epoch places socialist development within this period or stage. Morgan, how you doing? Great to see you, Morgan. Socialist influences and is influenced by imperialism, the time of its development. As is well known, Lenin defines imperialism as a stage of capitalism characterized by five basic features: monopoly, finance capital, export of capital rather than the export of commodities, international associations of monopoly capital, and the division of the world among the largest capitalist powers. Uneven development and colonial exploitation combine combinations of different labor processes, different forms of exploitation, different modes of production, and thus quintessential elements of imperialism, placing socialism within the imperialist epoch. Balabar recognizes the intermeshing recognizes this intermeshing. Yet in his effort to refute the idea that socialism is a distinct mode of production, he gives a misleading presentation of capitalism. He presents capital as the absolute separation of the laborer from the means of production, despite the fact that formal substantation allows for a continued connection. He centers the buying and selling of labor power, even as a wage labor is found in non-capitalist labor arrangements. He emotes capital's law of motion, which would help make a sense of the combinations of different labor processes. He says that all law from the beginning of capitalist onwards is bourgeoisie, which neglects the continuation of feudal legal forms as well as the common law tradition. And most significant, he presumes temporal progress in linearly imposing historical direction on top of his assumptions of stages. The relation between labor and capital, Balabar writes, is the last possible relation of exploitation in history. Once having arrived there, you can neither return to former modes of exploitation, in which the laborer enjoys a certain form of possession of his means of production and certain individual control over their use, nor go forward to a new mode of exploitation. Balabar echoes Marx here. Today, such claims of finality and irreversibility aren't compelling, particularly in the wake of the defeat of the workers' movement at the end of the 20th century and the rise of new forms of servitude and exploitation in the 21st. Former Marxist centuries have lost the power to convince. Uber drivers, for example, enjoy a certain form of possession of their means of production, and a certain individual control over their use. And this very enjoyment is the mechanism through which capital is able to escape the constraints put on it by the victories in working class struggle. Entire countries can win independence, overthrowing their colonial oppressors, only to find themselves bound to capitalist financial institutions, corporate investments, and internal trade arguments. They have no choice but to sign. The very fact that socialism denotes a form of struggle and transition occurring during the imperialist era, and that during the era socialism and imperialism affect and transform each other, means there are no guarantees. Antonio Negri agrees with Balabar that socialism is a stage of capitalism. Where he disagrees is whether it can be understood as a transitional state in the development of communism. I mean, Negri claims that communism is in no case as product of capitalist development. It is radical inversion. Rather than theorizing the transition of communism, Negri replaces transition with communism. Communism is the actual movement that inverts and negates capital. Negri makes this claim in the context of a closing reading of the Grundrisse as a theory of revolutionary subjectivity. His argument depends on a real substantation. The development of machinery transforms labor processes from the benefit of capital. The product, knowledge, and skills of workers are absorbed into machines, that is, fixed capital. At the same time, because capital necessarily exceeds use, is utterly indifferent to any specific form of use value. Machinery can appear as the most adequate form of capital. That form is circulating capital, not fixed capital. Productive capital thus involves the labor process and circulation, capital's socialist movement. Negri writes, real substantation of labor can't but be in the same movement, real substantation of society. Just as machinery transforms the labor process, so does circulation transform society. Capital's substantation of society has repercussions for the theory of value. Wealth creation depends less on the labor time and more on the application of science and technology to production. This creates contradictions. On the one hand, capital posits labor time in the measure and source of wealth. On the other, machinery reduces necessary labor time. With the widespread adaptation of machinery, capital diminished necessary labor time in order to increase surplus labor time, making surplus labor time a condition for necessary labor time. The very machinery that should make it possible for workers to have more free time ends up locking them into longer hours because of its capitalist form. In Factory of Strategy, Negri summarizes the analysis. The law of value, which ought to represent the rationality of exploitation, and the scientific key of it to its interpretation, must lose its radicalization and legitimizing plausibility within the very development of the capitalist mode of production. Marx shows how the demise of the function of the law of value simultaneously corresponds, as cause and effect, to the enormous and formidable growth of the productive, free, innovative potential of the proletariat. Everybody understands the reopen the economy is just code for kicking people off employment, right? Capitalism has always forced people to choose risking their health or homelessness, starvation. But it reached a cruel new height, and I can't fathom why people still accept it. I'm not sure about your first part. I would agree somewhat with the second part. And welcome in, Gamer J. I hope you're having a good day. Under conditions of real substantiation, the form of law values its capitalist command. Abolishing or negating this power of command is communism. Real substantiation, undoing of the theory of value makes socialism impossible. As a stage where each is compromised in accordance with their work. Socialism presumes that there is some kind of radical quantitative measure capable of ensuring a fair distribution. Large-scale industries' collective worker eliminates the possibility of such a measurement. Distribution or redistribution can be determined only on the basis of political criteria, which demonstrates the pointlessness of re-radicalization, the capitalist law of value. Since capitalism has already undermined the function of the law of value, what is necessary is destroying every form of command immediately and liberating class from labor. The abolition of command, and along with it the machinery and technology compromising capitalist command's material structure, thereby replaces transition with communism. The liberation of living labor is negri rather in enigmatically puts it, it is not the transition that reveals itself and eliminates itself in the form of communism, but rather it is communism that takes the form of the transition. Communism is the process through which working class subjectivity emerges within and in violent antagonism to capitalism. That Negri's argument is presumed on real substantiation implies that formal substantiation isn't significantly capitalist from communist movement. It is the widespread adaptation of machinery, the development of industry on a large scale, that leads to the breakdown of the law of value and its transformation into nothing but capitalist command. A completed to Heruthian's term, capitalism therefore appears to be necessary for communist movement. And this is the case, communism becomes a project of the West or the North. Fully industrializing countries, their developed perhaps not only left behind but perpetually pushed behind and away from communist possibilities. The colonized or formerly colonized remain outside a communist future. Communism unavailable as a name for their liberation. Paradoxically, or perhaps ironically, given Negri's justified distance from Eurocommunism, communism appears as the self-conscious strictly of the European working class rather than the orientation of victory to worker and peasant struggles in Russia and China. If Luxemburg is correct regarding capitalist dependence on an outside, or if Lenin is correct regarding imperialism as an epoch of the territorial division of the world into colonial possessions, then communism seems literally unreachable. Not simply antagonistic to capital, but but so separate from it as to be unable to touch it. Working class subjectivity emerges as an autonomous process of self-valorization in and as separation from capital without admixture, without imbrication, not unlike the world thesis Belabar correctly rejects. Sorry, I'm just kind of reading chat here. Sorry about that. The premise of real subsidization, unfortunately pervasive on the contemporary left, not last because of the influence of communization theorists, erases differentiation within capitalism. Remnants of the past that could be appropriate for communism forms of communal belonging say or indigenous practice of agriculture farming disappear. Non-capitalist labor processes and their role in the supporting as well as hindering the development of capitalism fall from view. Layers of history are flattened out into a smooth, uniform present. From all Negri's instance of on overthrowing all kinds of necessary and determination attributed to the process of transition. He sneaks them in through the back door of real subsumptation. Not only do we know where we are going, communism is already there. But what if it's not? Negri's erasure of multiple temporalities and his assumption of direct communism as what opposes and follows capitalism preclude consideration of what happens if workers lose, capital triumphs, and the whole apparatus of exploitation and command continues churning along. Fortunately, his analysis suggests ways to understand that repercussions of working class defeat, even as he takes perspective of workers' victory. Negri's account of the change from surplus value to capitalist command highlights the way the law of value becomes implausible within capitalism. Capital's own process eroded, discontinuing wage labor from any materially produced economic basis. Wages and salaries determined politically, linked to the maintenance of class structure. Repercussions of this shift to command appeared in the gross inequalities in pay between executives, executives and employees, between upper management and lower tier workers, between platform billionaires and the sector of the servants. The limits of the heights and depths of compensation are political, dependent on power. Are the holders of wealth able to command tax cuts? Are those who sell their labor power to survive able to unionize? Do interest rates encourage debt? And how do these debts contribute to the class formation? By allowing, say, purchasers of debt to increase their wealth while debtors themselves become virtual prisoners perpetually bound to the endless repayment. Um, Even more significant are the limits that investment in fixed capital come up against. Widespread adaptation of machinery intensifies competition and diminishes returns. As Robert Brenner and Aaron Benave, Bananave argue, overcapacity in world markets from manufactured goods has driven global deindustrialization and stagnation. In effect, has been the shedding of jobs in industry and a dramatic increase in jobs in services. Non-standard and informal employment has expanded, especially in the global south, as workers cobble together income from different forms of labor services. From one angle, self-employment looks like self-exploitation. From another, it appears as general servitude, dependence on the consumption habits of service seekers with disposable income. Sorry, I done lost my place. The fragmentation and disintegration of labor in the context of deindustrialization suggests that contra Nagri capitalist development is clearly reversible and dependent on multiple forms of non-capitalist labor. Pursuing analysis of capital on real substation today misses the opportunity to see the struggles linked to fragmenting and declining capitalism as locations of its weakness. Its inability to serve is its own conditions. Its own conditions. Correlative to declining economic growth and the steady rise in services has been hoarding and reenteringism. Renterism, okay. Capital accumulation occurs more from intellectual property, patents, and fees than from the production of good from rent rather than profit. Corporations don't invest their proceeds. They buy back stocks and increase executive compensation, eating their profits in old seigneurial style. Capitalist law of motion turn into their opposites as the drive to accumulate incentives, plunder and hoarding, rather than investment and improvement. Bolivar observes that periods of transition are characterized by the coexistence of several models of production, extracted from the assumption that we know what we are transitioning to. His insight suggests that our present may not be accurately described simply as capitalist. It may in fact be becoming something else, something where feudal dynamics emerge out of capitalist incentives. Coexistence points to the ways that the same labor processes may follow different laws of motion. Service labor may be reproduced, but not productive. More likely remunerated out of compensation funds the consumed as a part of production. In the same vein, when finance operates destructively, does it even make sense to think of it as capitalist? Leveraged buyouts enables financiers to take over companies, saddle them with debt, and sell off their components. Startups like WeWork and Uber rely on massive infusions of private equity to disrupt entire sectors. Complex debt and instruments led to over $7 trillion of losses in the 2008 financial crisis. The logic here is feudal pillage and plunder. Balabar's emphasis on imperialism as a stage of capitalism reminds us of the constructive unevenness of global capital. The world isn't smooth or flat. It compromises losers and winners, poor and rich, exploited and exploiter. Capital relies on the unevenness on non-capitalist modes of production, labor processes, and forms of exploitation. Such reliance indicates points of weakness. Whether these weaknesses will support or undermine capital, whether they can be mobilized on behalf of emancipation or commanded in for something worse depends on political struggle. And that was chapter 2. Yeah, that's